You guys ready? I've been practicing 250 years for this. So welcome everyone to tonight's lecture from Sinai to the Constitution. And tonight we're going to be discussing the Jewish values that shaped America. Not many Jewish people know that there are many Jewish values that were very foundational in creating the country that we know. There was a man, his name was Shmerel Katzenallen-Boygen. And he comes to Ellis Island, and his friend tells him, Shmerel Katzenallen-Boygen, it's not a good American name. You got to pick something more American. So he tells him, Sam Cohen. It's, it keeps the Jewishness a little bit, but it's easy. So he says, okay, Sam Cohen, I'll do it. So he makes his way to the immigration office, and he has to walk up all these steps. By the time he gets to the top, he's huffing and he's puffing. Whew. And, he caught off guard. The officer turns to him and says, name? And he says, Schein vergessen. In Yiddish means, I forgot already. Schein vergessen. I already forgot the name that I was choose. Schein vergessen. And the officer looks at him and says, well, Sean Ferguson, welcome to America. The very first Jews that came to America were 23 refugees. They did not come here to try to find something special. They just came because they were trying to escape. They were living originally in Spain. Their family was living in Spain. And when the Inquisition started, they had to run away to Portugal. And when the Inquisition made its way to Portugal, they had to run away. They made their way to Brazil. Brazil at the time was under Dutch rule. And for a while, they were okay there. But then Portugal reconquered Brazil. And they brought the Inquisition with it. And they had to flee. They had to run. So they made their way to New Amsterdam. And the issue was that they didn't have anything. They had literally the shirts on their back, and that's it. No money, no resources, zilch, nada. And they couldn't even pay the fee for the boat that took them there. And the captain, his name was Peter Stuyvesant, and he arrested them. And he's, you can't pay, you go to jail. And he in fact, he actually wanted to expel them. And he wanted to expel what he called, and I quote, this deceitful race. And there were Jews that had to get involved that were from Holland, which was connected to this West Indian Dutch company. And the Jews in Holland were able to move some things around. I mean, it helped that they were investors in the company, and they got these Jews freed reluctantly, but they were allowed to live in America. But they didn't have equal rights, not yet, at least. And fast forward a few years. This was 1654. So fast forward a few years, many years, and slowly what started as a reluctant acceptance turned into a full acceptance. In fact, George Washington, he wrote a letter. In the back we got. George Washington wrote a letter to the Jewish community in Rhode Island. And this was 1790. He wrote, and I read, and this is just a part of the letter. He writes, for happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. And he ends off, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. And by the way, that's a quote from the Torah, from the Tanakh, that last part. America has really been tremendous in being a place of freedom, a place where Jewish people were able to call home. In many people, many scholars in the Jewish world call America Medina Shel Chesed, which means the country of kindness, or the kingdom of kindness. While the whole entire world, much of the world were persecuting Jewish people and maybe treating them as second-class citizens, America was a place where they were, for the most part, welcome with eventually equal rights as everyone else. And this year, we're celebrating America's 250th birthday. And in Judaism, a birthday is a time to reflect. It's a time to assess and ask yourself, how can we grow? Every personal birthday, we should do this. The birthday of the world, we do this on Rosh Hashanah. And maybe the birthday of the country as well. So tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the values that shaped our country and how we can learn from them and grow by understanding how this country was made. So in order to understand the founding fathers, we need to go back a little bit and understand the pilgrims that came here. The first English settlers that came to America, they laid down the spiritual foundation for what would eventually be built as the United States of America. They came not as adventurers looking for gold. They came because they wanted religious freedom. They wanted a place where they could practice their belief system without persecution, without oppression. And they had a very deep belief in God. In fact, they believed that God was very actively involved in their life. In Hebrew, we call this hashgacha pratis. And it's a very beautiful concept where God runs the entire world. He didn't just create the world 6,000 years ago and then walk away and said, hey, you guys figure it out. God runs the world, and he takes care of the world. And everything that needs to happen, happens. And everything that is not supposed to happen, doesn't happen. And it's definitely a sobering thought. When we think of our life, everything that happens to us is for a reason, for a purpose. But the pilgrims felt that. And that's why after the first winter, they celebrated what they called Thanksgiving. Half of their group perished. And they took a moment, they said, you know what, thank God that we're alive. Because God must have chosen us to survive. And the pilgrims saw themselves within the biblical narrative of the Torah. The Jewish people in the Torah were slaves in Egypt, oppressed by the Pharaoh, and they made their way out of Egypt, escaped the oppression, and crossed the sea and into the wilderness, made their way to the promised land. And the pilgrims, they saw themselves in that same story. They left the oppression of King George in England. They crossed the sea, and they made their way to the promised land, to America. It's interesting that before they even got off the Mayflower, they made what's called the Mayflower Compact. And when it comes to societies, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs points out that there's 3 ways that you could build a society. There's 3 ways societies are made. One of them is through what's called conquest, where someone comes along and just conquers the land, and then he basically just tells people what to do. And there's not much you could Not much you could argue about. And a good example would be the pharaohs in ancient Egypt, or maybe even Napoleon in France. And the second way that societies are made is by gradual evolvement. Things evolve slowly. There's a certain culture that gets created. People act a certain way. An example of that would be England. Today, England, there's so much that England has and does, not because someone decided so, but that's just how they've been doing it for so long, even though most of it's symbolic. The third way is where you make a covenant, you make a pact, you make a deal. People get together and they say, you know what, let's decide to follow a set of rules. Let's decide to follow a set of rules. And that's essentially what the Mayflower Compact was. Let's decide that we're gonna work together. And if you look at the Torah has the Jewish people, they came out of Egypt. They made their way into the wilderness, and the first stop is Mount Sinai. And what happens at Mount Sinai? God makes a covenant with the Jewish people. And that's how the Jewish nation is created. That's how the Jewish nation is made. Till then, they were just a family. They grew to a large number, but there was nothing really that solidified them as a nation. Only once they got the Torah, they made a deal with God. God says, follow the Torah. And God says, we said yes. We said we'll follow the Torah. And God says, I'll be there to protect you, make you the chosen nation. And boom, you have the Jewish nation. And then later, they made their way to the land of Israel and established a bunch of laws there. But the very beginning started with a covenant. And I think it's very interesting that America started essentially the same way. Now this belief in God that the Pilgrims had continued all the way to the Founding Fathers. We see this when, after the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Congress said we need a seal. We need a seal for the United States of America. So they set up the first committee, which was Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. And they proposed a seal of the United States. And the seal looked something like this. This is a rendition of it, because we don't have the actual drawing of what they came up with. We had a transcript of the meeting, but it looked something along the lines of this, where you have the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, crossing the sea, and you see in the back Moses splitting the sea, and the Egyptians are drowning in the water, and you even have in the back, you have the cloud, the fire that led the Jewish people through the wilderness. Fascinating. So you see that the Founding Fathers had this deep belief in God, and also a good understanding of the biblical Torah, the Torah the Hebrew Bible, what they call the Hebrew Bible, I call the Torah. Now, Congress did not accept this design. Fast forward 6 years and another 3 committees, and they ended up with the seal that we all know, which is the eagle on the front, and then the pyramid in the back, and it's actually on the $1 bill. So if you look at your dollar bill, I put a dollar bill on everyone's chair. If you look at the dollar bill, the back of the dollar bill has 2 sides of a seal. On the right side, you have the eagle, which is the front side, and on the left, you have the back of this, the back side of this seal. And I just want to point out one thing that they did approve, which is you have the 13 levels of the pyramid, which represent the 13 colonies, but then you have this eye on the top. And the eye on the top represents the eye of providence. This divine God that watches over and protects us. And this is the ideas that the founding fathers used to establish the country we live in. And in fact, many of the founding fathers believed that in order to create a just society, you need to understand the Hebrew Bible. You need to understand the Hebrew Bible. In fact, James Madison studied Hebrew at Princeton. And Yale's logo, a little bit of a blurry photo, but Yale's logo has Hebrew words on it. It says Urim v'Tumim, which means light and truth, or that's one way to translate it. But it was Urim v'Tumim was actually something that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest in the Holy Temple, the Beit HaMikdash, would wear, and he would use it to get messages from God. But Urim v'Tumim, they put on light and truth. They put on the Yale's logo. On the Liberty Bell, engraved on the Liberty Bell, is a verse from the Torah, from Vayikra, which says, proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And if you go to the Supreme Court, there's an engraved thing on the top, and the depiction in the middle is supposed to be Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu. So one of the most, I think the most beautiful ideas that the founding fathers took from the Torah was the idea of equality. How did the founding fathers take the idea of equality from the Torah? So let's go back. It's 1770, and there's tension is rising among the American colonies in England, and at a certain point they realized that there's no way to reconcile this. They have to. They're going to declare independence. So they write a Declaration of Independence, but the Declaration of Independence is not just, we declare independence, have a good day. It's actually in there is written a bunch of values and ideals of what this nation would be built on. And in fact, you read the Declaration of Independence, it says as follows: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So where does this idea come from? All men are created equal? Who said? Who said? I know people who eat more than me, who run faster than me, and make more money than me. What do you mean people are equal? In fact, there's an old myth. The Greek comes from ancient Greece. It's called the myth of metals. The myth of the metals. And Plato taught this. One of the philosophers of Greece. Hey, you come to Chabad, you learn about Plato. Not the Plato my kids play with. It's a different Plato. So he said that people, and this is what they believed, people are created with different levels. There's gold people, there's silver people, and then there's the bronze and iron people, the common people. The gold are the elites, the people in power. The silver are the people that have money and maybe they're gonna be in power someday or something like that. They're the middle ground. And then there's the common folk, the peddlers and the shoemakers. They're and they believe that you can't go up. You can't go up to a different rung. If you're a copper person, you're copper forever, and if you're gold forever. Which is obviously very problematic, because you have someone who believes they're gold. I'm better than everybody else. And then they feel that they could step on everybody else. They abuse their power because I'm a step higher than everybody. So what's the problem? Just like we step on the ground, we don't have a problem stepping on the ground, because the ground is made of dust, and we consider ourselves better than dust. So we step on the ground, So if they thought of themselves that they were gold, why can't they step on someone who's copper? It's a big problem. There's other issues. And that is that you have this inequality before the law, where the people who are on top, the elites, they could do whatever they want, and no one could say anything because they're above the law. The law is for the iron and copper people, but for me, I'm the gold. I'm gold. I'm golden. Can't touch this. So the third problem is that you have no universal education. Only the elites are educated, and then you have the people, the common people are illiterate. They can't read, they can't write, and they don't even get an opportunity to be able to do that. And this is what people believe. This was a natural belief that people had. Comes along the Torah. You look at the Torah, you open up the Torah, and you find something fascinating. The Torah says, and God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Which tells you that if every single person is created in the image of God, then it means that every single person has this infinite creator that created them. And if I'm created by an infinite creator, and you're created by an infinite creator, then how are you any better than me? We all are created in the image of God. God created me just like him because I am infinitely valuable, and God created everyone else in his image because they are also infinitely valuable. So you don't have gold people, you don't have silver people, you don't have copper people, and you don't have the ability for someone to say, I'm greater than you, and I could step on you. It doesn't exist in the Torah because our value comes from God, and God is, you can't measure the value of God. So everyone has infinite value. Now I do want to point out that although God created everyone in his image, it's important to note that that doesn't mean that everyone's the same. Equal doesn't mean the same, because someone could be equally valuable, but very different. If you say that everyone's the same, you have a different problem. If you say everyone's the same, then everyone is replaceable. Because if I can't do it, then just get someone else. Every business owner knows that they have an employee, he's not doing the job right. I'll hire somebody else. Because every employee is replaceable. Unless, obviously, you have someone who's gold. But when God created humanity, he created everyone with infinite value, but everyone also is unique. Everyone has a unique purpose, a unique mission in life that nobody else can replicate in the entire world. So if I don't do my job, then nobody can do my job. Which is a beautiful idea, definitely something to think about, something to some food for thought. But how did the founding fathers get this idea? Where did they get it from? So in a lot of these what they call Judeo-Christian values, Christianity took the Torah many years ago, and they became part of the Christian faith. But this idea of equality was not part of mainstream Christianity for centuries. So how did that make its way into the minds of the founding fathers till they made it an American value? So we're going to watch a video on this idea, on how this concept became known to the founding fathers.
Right at the beginning, the Torah teaches that every human has inherent value. Each person is created in the image of the divine. Not just kings, not just nobles, everyone. It was a radical idea in the ancient world. and it remained distinctly Jewish for millennia. Christianity absorbed many Jewish concepts, but for centuries, this one didn't become a central defining doctrine. So how did the ancient Jewish concept of human equality become a cornerstone of modern Western political thought? Enter John Locke, the 17th century English philosopher whose foundational work, Two Treatises of Government, challenged the divine right of kings, one of the dominant political theories of his day, which claimed that monarchs derived their authority directly from God and were not accountable to their subjects. To challenge that idea, Locke reached back past centuries of European political thought and drew from the Torah's account of creation. He argued that equality is a natural, unalterable right established by God at the dawn of time. Human beings, he writes, are all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker, furnished with like faculties, and therefore there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us. In other words, no person is born with a natural right to rule over another, and from there Locke concludes that no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. Yechiel Leiter, an American-born Israeli scholar and current Israeli ambassador to the US, has written extensively on John Locke's political philosophy. He explains that according to Locke, the basis for equality is theology, not logic.
And went through the two treatises of government, I found something absolutely amazing. The first treatise, which is almost entirely Hebrew Bible sources, the most quoted source in the second treatise, which is the basis for his entire political edifice, is also Hebrew Bible. Because if you begin your entire philosophical, theological, political edifice with, in the beginning God created, all of humankind are God's creations, then you naturally base the notion of rights on equality. You base the notion of freedom on equality. Man is born equal and man is born free. You have the human being the product of God, if you will. God mixes his labor in creation, therefore we are his. We can't be taken away by an arbitrary and absolute monarch. We cannot have our rights deprived because they are inalienable. I mean, just think about that, the concept of an inalienable right. The idea of an inalienable right comes from Locke because you can't take God's rights away. That's where inalienable right comes from.
Locke's conclusions are the bedrock of modern liberalism, and they come straight out of Genesis. These ideas, radical in Locke's time, leapt into the heart of the American experiment. The founding fathers enshrined his biblical argument for equality as a foundational American value and a self-evident truth in the Declaration of Independence.
If you take a look at the two treaties of government and you compare it with the Declaration of Independence, what you find is that whole paragraphs are pretty much copy-pasted from the two treaties into the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a thoroughly Lockean document.
Today's Western idea of equality rests on a Torah truth. Every human being is created in the image of God.
Now, we have to be honest for a second, historically honest. America did not always live up to this ideal. It was sometimes ignored or denied, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it's always been an American value. And it's been, we've definitely fought over it, how to understand it. But the fact that it's there shows that it's an American value. And when it comes to values in our life as well, we don't always live up to our values. We don't always live up to our ideals. But that doesn't mean we have to throw the value or ideal in the garbage. We can say, this is what I should be doing. And you know what? One day I'll get there. One day I'll get there. So we can keep the value, And we work to try and achieve it. And as Jews, we have many values in the Torah that we all try and strive to achieve. And one at a time we work on them, but we don't throw the values in the garbage just because we can't do them today. And I think that this idea rings true right here, that this idea of equality was always an American value. We just had to work on it a little bit, and maybe we could still work on it a little bit, but definitely something that was always there. They say there was an American from Texas who went to go visit his friend in Israel, and his Israeli friend is showing him around his farm in Israel, and the Texan is, he's looking, very nice, but he tells the Israeli, "Let me tell you something. If I get into my tractor and I start driving my tractor from one end of my land, and I go, by the time sunset sets, I still won't be at the other end of my land." And the Israeli looks at him and says, "Yeah, I also had a tractor like that before." So when the founding fathers were looking to create a just and great country, they needed to make sure that no one has too much power, because that's really what they were running from. When you have someone who has too much power, or a few people who have too much power, you end up having a lot of problems. And they found that the people who control the land, the real estate, often control the people. So when the founding fathers wanted to build this country, they needed to create a country. They needed to build a system that wouldn't allow people to just collect all the land. And once you have some people who own all the land, then you have big problems. But how do you do it? How do you ensure that nobody has too much, is in charge of too much property? So there was a Christian Dutch scholar. His name was Petrus Cannaeus. He was one of the European, he was a Hebraist. And he would look into the Torah to try to find and build a just society. And he wrote a book called The Hebrew Republic. And while he's studying the Torah, he finds this idea in the Torah called the Jubilee Law. And he called it the agrarian law, but I'll call it the Jubilee Law. Or it's in Hebrew we say the Yovel laws. But what is it? What is this Yovel law? So when the Jewish people made their way to the land of Israel, they divided up the land. There was 12 tribes. Each tribe had many families, and they divided the land equally. Every tribe got a portion. Every family got a portion. And what ended up happening was that when someone passes away, the property goes to their kids. It gets divided among their kids and then their kids. And that way, you have a equally divided land. Obviously, there's one problem, is that someone falls on hard times. They can't afford their land anymore, so they sell it. Some wealthy guy comes along, whoop, he snatches it up. Another guy loses his business. He can't afford his land, so the wealthy guy grabs his land. And before you know it, you have this wealthy guy, maybe a few wealthy guys, who own half the land. So the Torah has what's called a Jubilee law, the Yovel. Every 50 years, all property that was sold goes back to their family, back to the people who owned it. So essentially, you can't sell any land in the land of Israel. Because I sell it, and I'm only selling it, I'm renting it to you until the Ovel, until the Jubilee. Every 50 years, there's a mark, and everything, there's an announcement, everything goes back. So I'm renting it to you for max 50 years, and then it goes back to me. And that way, no one could come along and begin to amass all of this land and all this property, and it remains equally distributed. Now, the founding fathers thought about that, but it's not so simple. Now, there was a man. There was a man named James Harrington. James Harrington was a James Harrington was a 17th century political thinker, and he wanted to design this ideal republic. Obviously, he didn't want there to be a monarch that would tell everyone what to do. And at the heart of his philosophy was this agrarian law based on Petrus Kanaeus. And James Harrington had a lot of influence on John Adams, one of the founding fathers. And in a letter from John Adams to James Sullivan, he writes as follows. Harrington has shown that power always follows property. The only possible way, then, of preserving the balance of power on the side of equal liberty and public virtue is to make the acquisition of land easy to every member of society, to make a division of the land into small quantities so that the multitude may be possessed of landed estates. If the multitude is possessed of the balance of real estate, the multitude will have the balance of power. And in that case, the multitude will take care of the liberty, virtue, and interest of the multitude in all acts of government. The idea is very simple. If people have a stake in the land, then they're going to want the country to succeed. If people are just renting from somebody else, then I don't care about the country. Because there's a few people that they're just doing whatever they want. So the only problem is, how do you do it? How do you divide the land equally? Obviously, you could use coercion. You could just take everyone's land away, and then, try to divide it equally. But that's definitely complicating. But what Thomas Jefferson decided to do was something a lot more simple, and he simply got rid of two rules. There was one rule that was called entail, and that was where these large estates were not able to be broken up or sold to other people. You had these elite people, wealthy nobles that owned tons of land, and they didn't. You could never break it up. The second law that he got rid of was called primogeniture, which is that there was a rule was that when someone dies, all of the property goes to the eldest son, and that way you have this concentrated one person who's in charge of the whole thing, and it doesn't get split up. So he simply got rid of these two ideas, these two rules, and naturally, what happens is over time, he'll sell a few pieces of land here and there. His kids will inherit it. He'll have 3 kids. Now it's divided into thirds, and then their kids, and then it's just a matter of time before the entire land is divided. And Thomas Jefferson enacted these reforms in Virginia, and then other senators followed, and then other countries followed as well. But besides for someone owning too much land, there's another way that someone could amass too much power. And we're going to watch another video about this idea.
Eighteenth-century French philosopher Charles de Montesquieu lived under the shadow of an absolute monarchy. He watched how unchecked power twists a nation. In the spirit of law, he presented a new way to protect freedom, arguing for three separate branches of governance. Legislative, those who craft the country's law. Executive, those who enforce the laws. Judicial, those who decide how the laws apply to individual situations. Montesquieu warned there would be an end to everything were the same man or the same body, whether of the nobles or of the people, to exercise those three powers. In simple words, freedom dies when power is concentrated. This wasn't just theory, it was an invitation, and America's founding fathers boldly accepted. After breaking free of King George III, they gathered in Philadelphia to craft a new nation. Having fought to escape concentrated power, they were determined to create a system that would serve the people instead of the other way around. They sliced government into three centers of authority, each powerful, each limited, each watching the others. Their constitution reads, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Congress makes laws, a president enforces laws. Courts interpret laws. Congress shapes the nation's laws and budgets, declares war, and approves major treaties, but it cannot enforce any of these. A president oversees federal agencies, appoints ambassadors and judges, acts as the commander-in-chief of the military, and heads the nation. But presidents cannot make laws. Courts interpret laws for real-life situations, settle disputes, and decide if a law clashes with the Constitution. But they cannot create or execute policy. Each branch with a mission and boundaries. But America's founders took it one step further. They didn't just divide power, they made the branches collide with each other. A presidential veto can stop Congress. Congress, with enough votes, can override that veto or remove the president from office. Courts can block unconstitutional laws or actions, yet the judges themselves are chosen by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It's not chaos, it's choreography. A constant, deliberate tension referred to as checks and balances, built to prevent the spark of tyranny from catching fire on American shores.
So although this idea is not, they didn't take it from the Torah exactly, but there are striking parallels, that's the word I was looking for, striking parallels that the Torah has very similar to this idea. If you look in the book of Devarim in the Torah, you'll find the Torah talks about what we call the Sanhedrin. This was the judicial power. There were 71 of the greatest sages of the time, and they were in charge of understanding the laws of the Torah. Right after that, the Torah continues and says that the Jewish people should have an executive power. The Torah calls a king, someone who leads the nation. But then the Torah right away goes on and tells us a bunch of rules that the king is not allowed to do. And in fact, one of the rules is that the king has to write a Torah for himself, and he has to carry it wherever he goes to remind himself that he should never stray from the ideals and values of the Torah. In fact, the Rambam writes that the Sanhedrin could take the king to court if he doesn't follow the Torah. And they could kick him out. So it's fascinating that although the founding fathers didn't take this idea from the Torah, if you read this idea in the Torah, this is incredibly different from every other nation and every other country at the time. The ancient world, the king, he made the rules. He made the rules. He enforced the rules, and then he decided to go back on his own rules. There was no rules. It was whatever he wanted. We all know the story of Purim in the book of Esther, where Haman comes to the king and says, "Let's get rid of the Jewish people." And he says, "Sure." sign on the dotted line, and that's it. Just like that, gets rid of an entire people, tries to get rid of an entire people. Obviously, we all know the story. The Jewish people end up surviving like we always do. But you think about the concept. The Torah says it doesn't work like that. Now, where's the third branch in Judaism? Where's our Congress? Now, the truth is that in Judaism, we don't need someone making laws, because we got our laws from God. We don't make the laws. And the truth is, everything is from God. The king always has to remain humble and remember that God is the one in charge. I mean, he's sitting there in the seat, but God is the one who runs the world. God is the one who runs the Jewish people, the Jewish nation. The judicial power, the Sanhedrin as well. They always have to remember that God is the one, at the end of the day, who decides what goes on. And in fact, if you look in the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, he writes a fascinating sentence, which reads, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, and the Lord is our king." This is from our Tanakh, our book. And it's interesting that this is exactly the three branches of power. You have the judge, which is the Supreme Court, or the Sanhedrin. You have the Lord is our lawgiver. He's the one who decides the laws. And then you have the Lord is our king. God is our king, and you're the president or the king, whatever country you're in. But so, although the founding fathers didn't take this idea from the Torah, at least not that I know of, but there's some very striking parallels. And if I could close with one more thought. We look at the pilgrims, and we see that they had an incredible amount of faith and deep belief in God. We look at the founding fathers, and the same thing, a deep belief in God. In fact, some of them even had a profound knowledge in the Torah, in what they call the Hebrew Bible. If you take a look at your dollar, we find a very fascinating line on the back of the dollar, right above where it says one, in one big word. It says, "In God we trust." In God we trust. How'd that make it there? How'd that make it to the dollar? It wasn't done by the founding fathers. It was a little later. This was in 1864, when the country was in middle of a civil war that literally tore the country apart. There was a popular movement to publicly declare the nation's dependence on God. And in the words of the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, he wrote, "No nation can be strong except in the strength of God, or safe except in his defense." And he asked and pushed to have a slogan put on a 2-cent coin. And they ended up coming up with, "In God we trust." In God we trust. And that eventually made its way to all of U.S. currency and ended up becoming the motto of our nation. There was once a guy, young man, who gets engaged, and he now has to go meet his future father-in-law. And they have a meeting. So the father-in-law asked him, "So tell me, what do you do for a living? What do you do all day?" He says, I study Torah. Study Torah. How are you going to pay your bills? He says, "God will provide." He says, "Wait a minute, you're going to have a mortgage? You're going to have kids, I'm assuming? How are you going to deal with that?" He says, "God will provide." Every question he asks him, he says, "God will provide." So the meeting's over. The father-in-law goes back home and he meets his wife. And his wife says, "No, how'd the meeting go?" So he says, "He's an interesting guy, but I like him. I met him once and he already thinks I'm God." So I want to point out two fascinating things about these words, "In God we trust." Number one is in the wording of the phrase, "In God we trust," and the second is in the placement of this phrase, "In God we trust." It says, in God we trust. What's the difference between trust and belief? You can say, I believe in God. You can say, I trust in God. What's the difference? The difference is that when you say belief, I believe in God, I could believe that there is a God. I could believe that there is a creator of the world. But it remains abstract. It remains distant. It's not necessarily my God. He's not necessarily actively involved in my life. But when I say I trust in God, what I'm essentially saying is I rely on God. That I believe that God is not just a creator that created the world many thousands of years ago, but that God is actively involved in my life. And that I could rely on God every single day. And I know and I trust that God will provide. Chassidus gives a fascinating example. You have thieves that believe in God. It exists. Now you could easily dismiss it and say, they don't really believe in God. They don't really believe in God. If they believed in God, they wouldn't be stealing. Everyone knows God doesn't want you to steal. But Chassidus says it's not necessarily true. It could be that there are thieves that really do believe in God, but they only believe in God. Meaning they believe that there is a creator. They have an intellectual acknowledgement that there is a creator. But I got to put food on the table. And when you got to put food on the table, we'll figure things out. God will look the other way, or God will forgive me, whatever the excuse they give themselves, but they go ahead and they steal. But when someone says, I trust in God, you can't steal and say, I trust in God. Because if you truly trusted in God, then you would say, I trust in God that God will provide. And if God will provide, what do I need to steal? God will provide me an honest way of an honest living. I don't need to go to a dishonest way, and I don't need to cheat people. And with that, I want to point out where we put this phrase, in God we trust. It's not on some monument somewhere, on a bell. It's not on a government building. It's not in a museum, but it's on our money. It's on our money. And what that tells you is that every single day, when we hold our money in our hand, we do business. We go buy things in the store. We work to pay our bills. Often we could get worried. We could get stressed about life and everything it throws at us. Or maybe we're chasing the next dollar, the next meeting, the next deal. And we could easily cut corners. We could easily cheat people. But if we remember and we just take a look down at our dollar bill and we read, in God we trust, and we remind ourselves that God runs the world. And if God runs the world, then He could provide me an honest way of making the same deal. It doesn't need to be in a dishonest way. Hashem will provide. So if there's one lesson that I'm taking away from America's 250th birthday, it's this one. In God we trust. And I think, although the Founding Fathers didn't put it here, it's based on them. A lot of it is based on them. And every time we look at our dollar bill, we should allow this phrase to be engraved in our hearts. And it should remind us about the great values that America was based off of, namely God. And may each of us use the blessings that Hashem gives us to fulfill our mission in life, our personal mission in life, and ultimately bring the ultimate purpose of the world with the coming of Mashiach. And may we continue to build this country as one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all for joining us, and God bless America.